Salve, my name is Geza Frank. I'm a musician, reenactor, and officer in the militia segment of the Austrian Army. Welcome to my 14-day experiment, where I'm going to wear the armor of a Roman Repenza soldier of the 4th century AD for 10 to 12 hours a day while eating Roman combat rations. All this is going to culminate in me scaling a 2,300 meter high mountain in full Roman combat gear. And this is day 11. Today I'm going to present a different outfit from the one I'm usually sporting. As you will have noticed, over the last few days I sported a red tunic or washed out red tunic and some blue trousers. So that's not a random choice of colors. If we look at the available iconography that depicts Roman soldiers either in armor or on some duty that is not ceremonial or not in a festive context, then we will notice that one of the most sported colors of their tunics will be hues of red. That means it could go from bright red and orange to dark red and brown shades with everything in between. Mostly those figures sport also blue or grey-blue trousers, sometimes also beige trousers, sometimes white trousers. There's a few things that indicate that the choice of color in Roman army dress is not totally random or free to choose by the individual as however they like. It seems that there is a pattern to the way that Roman soldiers are dressed in terms of color. Several sources talk about a castrensis vestis or a tunica militaris, which indicates that this is a garment with specific properties. Notably, in relation to other textual fragments that, for example, talk about the Roman soldier as being nicknamed Russati, the red ones. There's also a passage indicating that a general would receive a tunica russata or an alabanticon. Those are all terminologies that possibly refer to red garments. We know also from the campaigns of Caesar and also of earlier Republican generals that the displaying of a red tunic above the commander's tent would be the signal to get ready for battle. So there is a strong connection between the color red and Mars, the god of war, of course. That's also why the red chariot racing team is often associated with Mars. Can we say with absolute certainty that red tunics would have been the standard garment for a Roman infantry soldier? No, we can't. Too many things remain yet unclear to be able to make a certain statement about that. However, if we are placed in front of a choice, what kind of color do I give to my garments? It is better to go with what is absolutely certainly sourced than with some sort of random guess. That means we have pretty strong evidence that at least a lot of Roman soldiers would have worn red tunics and would have worn something like blue trousers accompanying them, or white trousers. Now, if we think that color was free to choose and everybody could just wear whatever they wanted, we would need good evidence for that. However, if we look at the iconography, we see there are patterns and that we have predominant colors and that we have also colors that are just worn in certain circumstances. For example, you would rarely, or actually almost never, see a Roman soldier depicted with a white tunic while wearing his armor and being in battle gear. You see people dressed in white tunics engaging in combat, but they're not wearing armor. So there seems to be a rule here. We can't say, well, there is some people in one mosaic, they are wearing white tunics, so we know that Romans wore white tunics with, for example, blue or red decorations. So I'm going to wear that and I'm going to wear just my armor over it because why not? If we look at people that are wearing armor, we see they're not wearing white tunics. And then we have to go to the texts because we can't just base everything on iconography. In the texts then, we see that they talk about the tunica candidata or tunica albata, which is candidata, it means that it's white. It's very white, and the candidata is usually mentioned as a garment worn for festive occasions in the presence of the emperor, for religious ceremonies or religious holidays, for festivities such as weddings, for example, etc., or triumphs. triumphs. In earlier century, very, very prominently, white tunics would have been worn in the triumph, which indicates it was a special garment for the special occasion and not a tunic that you would wear just randomly at all times and at all occasions. However, in the late Roman army, we see predominantly two colors of tunics worn by soldiers, and that is red as the most predominant one, and there's blue, such as I'm wearing right now. There's also green, but green is very rare, and we are not sure if that is not associated to very special regiments in the vicinity of the imperial court. For example, like Protectores Domestici or some of the Palatina regiments. Now, let's get to the color blue. If we think that the most commonly color worn by Roman infantry soldiers is indeed a red tunic, then why do we see also quite a lot of soldiers depicted by wearing blue tunics? It's a very good question. We don't have an answer for that. There's just several hypotheses that we can put forward. For example, we know that blue was a color often sported by centurions. It was a rank that liked to wear blue cloaks, for example. Now, can we infer that they wore blue tunics to stand out? No, we can make a hypothesis. For example, there is a letter from the 4th century by Julian, Emperor Julian, who states that Roman officers are very easily identified by their clothes. So that means that somehow the Roman officer stands out from the normal trooper. Now there is also the hypothesis that blue might be associated with the cavalry. As Professor Ubel, for example, noted, there is a correlation between the use of blue vexilla and the cavalry, whereas infantry often used the red vexillum. Can we infer that the cavalry might have used or preferred to use blue tunics? It's totally possible. If we look back at the chariot racing teams, blue is the color associated often with Neptune, who is not only the lord of the sea, but also the patron of the horses. We have also the commonly held belief that certain marine troops, so sailors and soldiers aboard ships, would use blue tunics. Vegetius is often interpreted as having said that this is for camouflage reasons. However, this notion is disputed or debated. It's not very clear if he actually meant that or not. It's from what Vegetius wrote, it's actually not really clearly inferable that he meant that those Marines were wearing blue tunics. However, it is possible. We have also depiction of people aboard ships, some of them wearing blue tunics, but the problem here is that we have also depictions of people and soldiers working on ships who do not wear blue tunics. My interpretation so far is that blue might have been a color indeed favored with higher ranks, favored with the cavalry, and that it is absolutely credible to portray, for example, the rank of centenarius with a blue tunic. We thereby cover several things. Blue is often depicted, but never really that there is a complete detachment wearing blue. We have complete detachment of soldiers wearing red. However, when there is a soldier clad in blue, there's never really a complete detachment of them. There's mostly one soldier or maybe two in the entire picture. Often they're in a position where you could say, well, that's a prominent position maybe an officer would have held. You see, also the cavalry doesn't always wear blue. There's a lot of cavalry people that are depicted with red tunics. So going from the evidence that we have, we do not actually have something precise telling us that a certain rank would wear blue tunics. However, we know that color was very important in the Roman army and that it was very important who was wearing what, which materials, very precise descriptions of which rank on the court or which kind of officer rank would wear what combinations of fabric. For example, half silk, half linen, or woolen, or full silk, for example, and which colors. So we can see that color and material was very important in the court surroundings, but also probably in the army, and that it was not a random choice which was to be worn. My interpretation is that an officer, possibly a centenarius or a ducenarius or tribune would maybe have favored blue. That way he would stick out, and that way we would cover what Julian wrote, that indeed Roman officers are very easily identified by the way they dress. That way we would also account for the frequency of the blue that we see and the prominent position it sometimes holds, and also sometimes that we see actual officers wearing the panoply of an officer and being identified as an officer by the scene that they are depicted in and that are wearing blue. Often those people wearing blue are also seen with sort of red or orange trousers. So we have a sort of pattern where red tunics are often associated with blue trousers, and where blue tunics are often associated with red trousers. So for today I chose to wear this blue tunic. This is very finely woven wool. It is woven to width so that I don't have to add the arms. I have here again the typical underarm slits, which allow me to pull out an arm and to then fasten, for example, those arms behind in a knot, which allows for working without the sleeves. It's very, very practical. And it has also the dimensions that we find often in Egypt. It's very broad and wide fabric. It is colored, dyed with indigo, so very, very expensive back then as well. Gives a nice blue tone. Going with that, I have also some more exquisite trousers that are made from a mixture of silk and linen, and they are dyed with a mixture of madder with a little bit of purple. That gives this sort of roseate purpley tone. Now there is a problem with this silk and linen mixture. It's a very, very nice and smooth fabric. However, those two fibers tend to not hold especially the linen, tend to not hold the color very well. So on those places where I walk a lot or where there's some friction, you can see that the color fades away quite quickly and becomes more of a rose shade. Also, the silk linen mixture, especially the silk here, it's a raw sort of silk, so it's not the proper silk that would be worn by really rich people. Is prone to breaking quite easily, so especially the foot parts. What I would advise is to not fall for the same trap as me. Don't go for raw silk, for natural raw silk, because that's not the type of silk that was used in antiquity really for such garments. Proper silk is much sturdier. It has a much better shine and actually takes up the color pretty well and stays colored very nicely. And this raw silk, even if it's in a mixture with linen, is pretty weak. Doesn't hold the coloring as nicely, and it is prone to breaking very easily. Another thing I'm going to present today are those greaves. These are very nice, excellently crafted greaves that I got from the Pustelak brothers. They are iron and based on some finds from Künzing. Now, we do not have any original greaves being dated to the 4th century. However, we have some evidence from later centuries, and we have some evidence from the 3rd century. So these are dated to the 3rd century in general. Why are we using them in the 4th century? Because those are the closest we have, and we have evidence for the 4th century soldiers using greaves as well. There is, for example, in the Rebus Bellicis a depiction of, it's a medieval copy of the Rebus Bellicis, but it shows greaves. We have a statue from the early 5th century from Aphrodisias which shows Mars and who is wearing greaves. Now, this could be an archaization as well, of course, but there's some textual references also in later centuries, for example, the Strategikon of Maricios, which also talks about greaves. So it's fair to assume that if we have a culture of wearing greaves in the 3rd century and then also in the 5th, 6th and 7th centuries, that the 4th century would not constitute a random gap. A lot of equipment that we had prior to the 4th century and after the 4th century was continued to be used in the 4th century. The army generally, especially at the start of the 4th century, was very well funded, and it was the largest that the Roman army would have probably ever gotten. So it is fair to assume that the use of greaves remained a thing. I chose to wear this more extravagant or more rare outfit today, not only to present it, but also to make our sword test today. I have here a very magnificent sword made by Argentinian master Leonardo da Luz, and it's a very interesting specimen. It is based on a very unique sword that was found in Budapest in a grave that is roughly dated to the last quarter of the 4th century. Looking at it, at first glance it displays some Asiatic features, and one would think that it might have some connection to the Alans or the Huns already. It's very likely that the grave predates the Huns' arrival in the area. However, that doesn't mean that a Hunnic sword or a sword from Central Asia wouldn't be able to be used there and come there. There's a few things that make people doubt that this is truly an Asiatic Spatha. As I said, this is not a one-to-one replica of the actual find. It is just inspired by that and has some elements that are the same as the original find from Budapest, namely this sort of kidney-shaped handle and the very prominent 3 studs at the top here, as well as the metal fittings here and here, which on the original find are more intricate. It has also this sort of nail here, which is fixed at the back. Very nice to look at. The original has traces of being heavily used. It's a very, very weird mix. The blade shape itself is not the same on the blade here that we are going to test later. This is more reminiscent of typical Spatha blades of the time. It's a bit shorter than the original Budapest specimen. It is very sharp, very nice to handle, very well balanced actually, and I am looking forward to testing it now, especially in direct comparison with another blade that I have, which predates this one by about 500 years. It is a long sword from a Gallic context from Latin D2 period. It is 90 centimeters long, and I'm gonna look forward to see how those 2 blades fare in terms of dealing damage, in terms of the reach and stabbing, and in terms of what they do against an area protected by 2 different sorts of chainmails. So I'm going to use one patch of chainmail that is riveted and is 6 millimeter, and the other one is butted and 5 millimeters. I'm going to stab both and I'm going to slash both, and I'm gonna see what happens. I don't expect much to be happening. I hope I will not damage the sharpness of the blade too much or the tip. It will be very interesting. What I'm going to use is 2 different types of meat. The one is belly fat meat from a pig, which will give us a good insight, especially with the stabbing and slashing of the belly area. And then I have also bought some ribs, which will give us more insight in terms of cutting through bones. So let's go and see what happens. Should be just exactly the right thing for this test. We have a nice layer of fat and skin on top, which should give us a good idea of what it is like when such a sword hits a belly. We put on it a butted chainmail and we'll see how it fares. First we start with this spear. See what this tip has as a penetration power. So here we see the tip penetrated that much. Didn't really do much damage. Left about this. Now we're going to test a piece of riveted chainmail, and we added also some felted wool, just like I'm wearing it underneath my chainmail. So that's basically the exact same setup that I'm wearing here. Same result as before. Absolutely no power to penetrate the chainmail, even with this tip. And because we added a layer of felt, there's actually no visible trace of any damage to the skin surface. Nice. Yes. And here we see what this spear does if the piece of meat is not protected. It goes all the way through. Now we try the butter chainmail again with this time the Spatha. I'm not putting the cloth underneath because I want to see how much actually damage this deals on butter chainmail without any subarmalis, because we don't have any evidence that suggests that, for example, Gallic people or early chainmail users used any sort of padding or padded clothing underneath. No damage again. Chainmail is too strong to be poked through just with a casual stab. No damage. Clean cut. All the bones are through. Now we're going to test the weapons of the Latin D2 period. First, the spear. And the tip penetrated the skin, which is quite a tough skin, but only about this deep from that angle. Well, I think it just ripped from the rope. It actually didn't slice it at all, other than that. But it didn't go through a bone. So we're just gonna try that again. So these tests showed us a few things. Chainmail is very effective. It prevents slashing exactly the same as it prevents stabbing in most cases. On a body that doesn't give the resistance of a fixed object, we can see that chainmail is a very, very effective protection. And even though you might get bruises, or even a broken bone when you're really hit very strongly, it's very unlikely that something is going to penetrate your chainmail unless you're getting hit full on by a cavalry charge and by an armor-piercing spear point. What we could see is that the Roman weapons generally fared a bit better than the Gallic weapons. The spear tip that are used in the Roman context is really one of those armor-piercing spear tips, with the meat giving way basically to my pressure, and with just one arm for a thrusting move. We could see that yes, it penetrated the chainmail to a certain degree, but just because of the form of the tip, it wouldn't pierce the armor as such. However, if I was attacking from horseback, with all the force and the speed of the horse behind me, then probably this spear would go through even the armor. With the Gallic spear, we could see that with the really wide leaf-formed tip, we are not gonna get very far with such a chainmail. The sides of the spear are usually very sharp, razor sharp, so it's a multi-purpose weapon. Piercing armor as such is maybe not its primary function. Because of the way the central spine of the spear is shaped, it has the ability to pierce. However, its very large shape, its very large surface, and the very leaf-shaped form make it harder, and you need a lot more force to pierce. We could see that the Gallic spear also had some trouble piercing the naked flesh without any armor protection. I was surprised by that, because the armor-piercing spear tip from the Roman spear went through it like butter. It really just hit, it pierced that first layer of skin, and then just went through it. The Gallic spear had a bit of a harder time, and you needed to aim quite well. Same with the sword. The Roman sword, the Roman Spatha, went through it as if there was no resistance at all. Also the slashing tests without armor, I barely felt any resistance there. It went through like through thin air. The Gallic sword, on the other side, inflicted some damage and exerted a lot of pressure on the meat, but because of the form, the blade's edges are shaped, it's not as cutting as the Roman sword by Leonardo that I have. What we can see here is, if we look very closely, then the very fine edge very sharp edge of this sword has some minor damage here in this area where I hit the chainmails really hard. I just used the one side for the chainmails and not the other side. And it's still very sharp, but you can feel that there is some damage here. Probably very easy to grind out, very easy to repair with a grinding stone. The tip doesn't have any visual damage whatsoever from the thrusting. A very fine weapon. I can only recommend Leonardo as a craftsman and an expert when it comes to swords of all sorts of time frames. Unfortunately, I lost the footage that I made at the time when I was doing the experiment, so I have to re-record the end here where I talk about this Gallic sword. Now, it is a very fine sword. I am very happy that I have it. It is crafted by a really great blacksmith in Germany, Stefan Vom. It is very sharp. However, as you can see, the angle of its edge is much bigger than on the Roman Spatha. That means that it does actually not slice through stuff as easily as the other sword. I believe that if we grinded the angle down a little bit more, it would have just as little problem with that as the other sword. Anyway, something very interesting here is that this edge has sustained absolutely no damage from hitting the chainmail. Nothing at all. And I noticed this already with this blade at another time when I hit a 13th century helmet very hard. The helmet had a visible damage, the sword and the sword's edge had no damage at all. So there's always a trade-off. Either you have a very sharp sword with a very small angle on the edge, or you have a sword like this one with a larger angle on the edge and you will have less damage. So yes, I'm looking forward to do some more tests with a different testing setup in the future. I'm also convinced that this edge here can perform better than what it did with the current setup that I had in the experiment. And I'm also very convinced that this sword has an absolute tremendous and enormous power slicing through things. I just need to find the setup where I can test that sufficiently well. I must say that the way I hung up the meat and the size of the meat as well was rather well suited for the Roman sword. That might give the impression that the Gallic weapons, the spear and this sword, are less suited or of an inferior quality, which is absolutely not the case. I want to repeat that. They are for different purposes, especially the spear with its very sharp edges is a weapon designed for combat, mostly against unarmored or barely armored opponents. The chainmails and armor was not as widespread in use with diverse Celtic people or the Gallic tribes, with only elites mostly sporting those armors. So this spear is absolutely not made to penetrate armor. It's made for mostly maybe for single combat and is a multi-purpose weapon. This sword here is mostly probably used in cavalry context. Although it has all the properties of later Roman Spathas, I just think that I need to make more tests with it in order to be able to say anything conclusive.